Hello, this is Charles Brewer, President of the Civil War Study Group here at Lake of the Woods. Welcome to this, the recording of our presentation on March 24th, 2023.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2023 annual dinner for the Civil War Study Group. Thank you very much for coming out. This is an excellent turnout, and I want to thank each and every one of you for being here and also for supporting the mission that the Civil War Study Group here at Lake of the Woods attempts to accomplish each and every month that we present programs and the various and other sundry things that we attempt to do. We are in our 13th year, and we have with us tonight some founding board members. And the person I'm looking at immediately is Pete Rainey. Pete and his wife Kathy no longer are living at Lake of the Woods, but they made many contributions here while they were here, including, of course, setting this group up with Craig Raines. Where's Craig? Craig Raines. And Joe Rokas. Now, he was a member of the board for only a brief period, but Joe Nordsick is there too. But, and so, for some newcomers like myself that are on the board, I'd like to introduce them. I'm Charles Brewer. Over here we have Bob's Wright, who is our treasurer, our money man. And also over here is Greg Nature, who has taken to filling the large shoes created by Joe Rokas, and he's now our secretary of our board. And as a side note, he and his wife Kathy organized all of this, so let's give them a And before I forget it, a big round of applause to Ryan and Sierra and their group for a great deal. So, and then completing the board, we're not finished yet. Tom Newgate, where are you? Okay, there he is. Right in front of me, you could have bowled me over. And let's see, I think that's it. Except, I have it covered. Because we are probably the only organization in Lake of the Woods that has a husband-wife board member team. Deke and Jill Eidelhart. And I'm not finished. I'm almost finished, but I'm not finished. Our vice president is Jack Fenn, and he's sitting at that. So I think that's it with all of the accolades. One of the things about an organization like this is that it takes a dedicated group of people to keep it running, but it also, and so that's us, the board members. Myself, I've just been talked into a third 3-year term as president. Because I'm in the process of grooming my successor, and you won't know who it is until, at any rate. But it also requires people like yourselves who come to our monthly meetings and then also come to this type of event as well. We do occasionally get from you recommendations for speakers or some events to put on, and we thank you for that, and we wish that you would keep up the good work. Civil War Study Group at gmail.com. Just send us an email anytime, and we'll be glad to take it up. But in any event, we have a speaker tonight. Our speaker is Don Pfanz, who, of course, gave that book to, who wrote the book?
Cindy.
Cindy, hey, Cindy, great. Don comes by his interest in the Civil War almost genetically. Let me explain that. He grew up on the Gettysburg battlefield, where his father, Harry W. Pfanz, worked as a National Park Service historian. Wow. And then after graduating from William and Mary in 1980, gee, that was 43 years ago. He followed his father into the National Park Service, becoming various tours. His first tour was right here, well, not here, but at the Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park from 1981 to 85. And then he went to the City Point unit of Petersburg National Battlefield from 85 to 88. Then from 88 to 91, the Sumter National Monument in Charleston, South Carolina. And then he returned to Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania, as a staff historian in 1991 and made many, many contributions there. And then he retired in 2013. That's 10 years ago. How's it been? Great. Okay, good. In addition to all of this, in the late 80s, I think I'm correct in saying this, Don was in the thick of the birth of the emerging battlefield preservation movement in Virginia. So a lot of this battlefield preservation started with this man here. So, great. He's the author of several books and numerous articles, most notably 2 books on Confederate General Richard S. Ewell, one titled Richard S. Ewell, A Soldier's Life, another, The Letters of General Richard S. Ewell, Stonewall's Successor. He wrote a book while he was at City Point called Lengthening Shadows, Abraham Lincoln at City Point. And then he also wrote a step-by-step 120-mile guide titled No Turning Back, a guide to the 1864 overland campaign from Wilderness, where it began, to Cold Harbor. So there's a lot of work there, and as I say, numerous articles. And we want to thank him for presenting his objections, by the way, to the Wilderness Crossing Project at last night's Planning Commission. Ellen and I were lucky enough to return from Richmond in time to catch on streaming video his comments. So that's how I know what a good impression he probably made to those present, and hopefully to the Planning Commission and Board of Supervisors people. Hopefully they were paying attention to that as well. A neighbor sent me a text describing that there was a rather large crowd there, and I texted back, see any pitchforks? But in any event, enough about me. We are very glad to welcome back Don back among us for this evening's presentation.
Does that sound good?
Yes, sir.
Well, it's very nice to be here tonight. I appreciate you all coming out on such a dreary evening to come and enjoy this dinner and to hear me speak tonight. I've seen some old friends here and met some new friends tonight. So it's a pleasure to have you all in the audience tonight. And it's just thrilling to me to see an audience this big for a Civil War gathering. Civil War roundtables, I don't even think can match the number of people that we have here tonight. So it's wonderful that you all have such a great interest in your local history. I wish that was true of all the people in the Fredericksburg area. Now, as you probably know, the local battlefield park where I used to work covers 4 major battlefields, one of which is Chancellorsville, which is considered Robert E. Lee's greatest victory, but it was a victory that was won not only because of Lee's daring and brilliance, but in equal or even larger part because of the blunders made by his opponent, Joe Hooker, and some of Hooker's commanders. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight is one of those blunders. Actually, if you go through the battle, you can almost pick out during the 6-day battle a major blunder that Joe Hooker made every day of the campaign. He had just done something different would have resulted in this being Lee's greatest defeat rather than Lee's greatest victory. But he didn't do that, and consequently, the battle has come down in history as, again, an example of Lee's brilliance. But today we're going to talk about one of the phases of the battle where things could have turned out much more differently had different decisions been made by Hooker and his commanders. And that is the episode related to Stonewall Jackson's flank attack on May the 2nd, 1862. Joe Hooker, after he was defeated here at Chancellorsville, fell back across the river and at that point had to try to defend his conduct here. And Joe Hooker, not being in the mold of Robert E. Lee, who, as you remember, after the Battle of Gettysburg said, this is all my fault, Joe Hooker basically said, this is the fault of everybody else. And he centered on 3 individuals. George Stoneman, who led his cavalry corps, who was supposed to circle behind Lee and cut Lee's supply lines, and didn't do a very good job of it, so he blamed Stoneman in part. He blamed John Sedgwick, who commanded his 6th Corps and was left back at Fredericksburg while Hooker came around to Chancellorsville, and Sedgwick was supposed to fight his way to Hooker's relief, which is interesting since Hooker had 6 of the Army 7th Corps, and Sedgwick was by himself, and yet Sedgwick was supposed to come to help Hooker. So it's an interesting commentary on that. But he blamed Sedgwick for not doing that. And finally, he's going to blame the 11th Corps. And of those 3 parties, the 11th Corps tended to get most of the criticism. But I think as we look at this tonight, we'll see that the Corps' poor showing was due less to the men in the rank and file of the Corps than due to the faulty leadership of Joe Hooker and his generals. Now, the 11th Corps was a very easy target for Joe Hooker. It was new to the Army. It was, I call it the stepchild of the Army. It had been formed in the fall of 1862, shortly, about the time of the Second Manassas, but didn't join the Army of the Potomac until just about the time of the Battle of Fredericksburg, and did not participate in that battle. It kind of left up in Northern Virginia to protect Washington, D.C. So the first battle that it fought with the Army of the Potomac was at Chancellorsville. So it's kind of the newcomer to the Army. And therefore its arrival was met with a measure of suspicion and mistrust. Part of this was simply because it was new to the Army, and consequently soldiers, you kind of have to prove yourself to the rest of the team, you might say, and the 11th Corps did not yet have a chance to do that. But it was also in part due to the inexperience of the soldiers inside the Corps. The 11th Corps consisted of a large number of untested units. 11 of the 27 units that would fight here at Chancellorsville had never before seen a Confederate soldier. So again, experience helps in wars as in other things. So that's a full 40% of the Corps. Again, it was pretty much untested. Perhaps even more worrisome were the regiments that did have experience. They were formed from Franz Siegel's 1st Corps, which had been formed largely from John Fremont's Mountain Department. Neither organization, the Mountain Department nor Siegel's 1st Corps, had a very illustrious history. Fremont's troops had been defeated by Stonewall Jackson at the Battle of Cross Keys, and Jackson later trounced Siegel's Corps at the Battle of Second Manassas. So both of them had suffered Stonewall's wrath earlier in the war and had not come out of it very well. Another worrisome point, if you were a member of the Army, was that the 11th Corps was made up of a large foreign element. There were more than a dozen people of a dozen nationalities represented in the Corps, many of them having come to the United States around the year 1848 due to a series of revolutions in Europe that had failed, and the revolutionaries were pretty much driven out of their countries and fled to America for safety. By far, the largest of these ethnic groups were Germans. 40% of the 11th Corps, which had 12,000 men roughly at the battle, were either German immigrants or first-generation German Americans. And that's reflected in the names of the officers in the Corps. Karl Schurz, Alexander Schimmelpfennig, Karl Buschbeck, Otto von Steinwehr, Leopold von Gilsa. These are not names you find in most other corps in the Army, at least not on a very large scale. And these men had come here, again, along with many other Germans, for either economic or political reasons in the years shortly before the Civil War. In fact, everybody knows about the large Irish immigration that happened in the 1840s due to the potato famine. But what's not often as well known is that actually there were more German immigrants during that period than there were Irish immigrants. So there's a large number of new German-American citizens in this country at the time the Civil War comes around, and many of them are going to serve in the Union Army. These Germans would settle in places like New York, Pennsylvania, Midwest, places like Milwaukee and St. Louis. Many of them, of course, assimilated into the local units with non-Germans, but others banded together with their neighbors and fellow German immigrants to form their own regiments. And then these were, in turn, grouped into brigades, and then eventually grouped into even divisions. So, and then they were brought together in this new organization called the 11th Corps. The 11th Corps is commanded by Franz Sigel, who was himself a German immigrant. He had attended the Baden Military Academy and was a leader of the 1848 revolutions in his native home state of Baden. When they failed, he fled to the United States, became a leader in the German-American community, and rallied support for Abraham Lincoln's election among the German-American community. And in good political fashion, Lincoln rewarded him by making him a general in the army. He was not a good general, but his troops were proud of him. They took great pride in their commander. And when they said, "I fight mit Sigel," they said it with a great deal of enthusiasm. However, Sigel was not here during the Battle of Chancellorsville. He resigned just about a month before the battle over a dispute in rank. He felt he was one of the higher ranking officers in the army and felt he deserved a bigger corps, more troops to fight under him. And the new commander, Joe Hooker, didn't agree. And so Sigel resigned in a huff, and Hooker was very happy to accept his resignation. And in his place, Hooker is going to appoint an old non-German general named Oliver Otis Howard, who I always call, he's known as O.O. Howard in most of the books. I call him Uh-Oh Howard because both at Chancellorsville and Gettysburg, his troops tend to be surprised on the battlefield. But O. Howard is at 33 one of the North's youngest major generals. He was a native of Maine, a graduate of Bowdoin College, where and later graduated fourth in his class at the United States Military Academy, and even served there as an assistant professor of mathematics, and was in that position when the Civil War began. He had proven himself in the years prior to Chancellorsville as a brave, if not brilliant, general. In 1862, as a brigadier general, he'd been wounded at the Battle of Seven Pines, and an injury that cost him his right arm. So he's going to go into this battle missing his right arm. He's later going to take command of John Sedgwick's division, which he's going to lead in attacks at Marie's Heights over in Fredericksburg in December of 1862. And as the Army's senior ranking division commander, when Franz Sigel steps aside, according to protocol, Howard is next in line to fill that position. And so Howard leaned on Hooker and said, you know, this is my right to have this position. And Hooker decided to give it to him. So he's going to come in about a month before the battle to take command of this group of this 11th Corps, again, many of whom are Germans. he was not welcomed with open arms by the Germans because, first of all, they didn't like losing their man, Franz Sigel. They looked upon O.O. Howard as a usurper. I don't think anybody would have been warmly welcomed by at least the German element of the 11th Corps once Sigel left. But in this case, Howard's going to receive a rougher reception than usual because he's so much different than the troops he's going to command. Howard was a very moral, teetotaling Christian, very much in the mold of Stonewall Jackson, except without the quirks and the military brains. And he's going to clash with the hard-drinking, profane, agnostic Germans who he's going to command. And so he arrives at the 11th Corps headquarters. He's going to get a little bit of a chilly reception, not only from the German troops, but also from some of the officers, some of whom felt that there should be promotions from within the Corps instead of bringing in this outsider. So all this is going to lead to some friction between Howard and the troops he's commanding, and all that's going to play a major role on May the 2nd here at Chancellorsville. Now, Joe Hooker was appointed to command the Army in January of 1863 after the Battle of Fredericksburg and the Mud March. At that point, the Army was very dispirited. It was rent by dissension and desertion. About 25,000 soldiers had just walked away after the battle. 25,000. That's like a fifth of the Army just left. So Joe Hooker had some work to do to revitalize the Army, to make it believe in itself again. And to Hooker's credit, he did just that. In a matter of 2 months or so, 2 or 3 months, Hooker took this rabble of dissatisfied troops and basically whipped them into what he termed was the finest army on the planet. Also, at 134,000 men, it was probably the largest army on the planet as well. Now, Hooker is going to take this massive army, which is twice the size of the army that Lee's able to muster at Chancellorsville. He's going to break it into 3 parts. One part under George Stoneman is going to sweep behind Lee with the cavalry and try to cut Lee's communications between Richmond and Lee's army. So cut off his communications, cut off his supplies, create havoc in his rear, you might say. The rest of the army is going to split into 2 pieces, the infantry. Part of that is going to stay opposite Fredericksburg to focus Lee's attention on that front, while the rest of the army is going to march upriver, cross at Kelly's Ford, which, as you know, is just a few miles upstream from us, and then come down along what's today Route 3 and come in at Lee from the rear. So now you have Sedgwick at Fredericksburg, Hooker with the other wing of the army coming in and forming Chancellorsville, and now Robert E. Lee is between the 2. At that point, as you know, Lee is going to divide his army and is going to bring the largest part out to Chancellorsville with Stonewall Jackson to fight against Joe Hooker. When Jackson does that, and when Lee does that, Hooker at that point is going to lose his nerve. He's going to, at that point, give up the offensive, which had been so successful up to that point, and is going to fall back to a defensive position centered on Chancellorsville, which is that building we saw in the picture at the beginning. The battle here at Chancellorsville is going to be fought within the bounds of the wilderness. And again, I don't have to tell you about the wilderness, but it's a huge area, but it extended as far east as between, it kind of ended somewhere between Chancellorsville and Salem Church, extended as far south as almost the Spotsylvania Courthouse. It's a huge 70 square mile area of, again, dense trees. But again, not the type of trees that we're likely to see today. What we see today is a climax forest where the trees have grown up over the course of decades, and there's now a tree canopy. What was here at that time were, again, short trees that had been, the timber had been cut for the iron industry, for the plank road, for other purposes, and what had grown up in place of these taller trees were stunted trees, of small undergrowth with a lot of vines and thickets. Very difficult for one man to walk through, much less for an army, which in those days fought shoulder to shoulder in long lines. Try to imagine those type of troops going through this jungle of vines and brambles and thorn bushes. It was not a good place to fight a battle. Pennsylvania described it as a wild, weird region. Everywhere was dense and trackless forest, he wrote. No other idea of the country can be given, save that it was a forest apparently without limit, with clearings so few and their space so contracted as scarcely to be considered as breaking the solemn monotony of tree, chaparral, and undergrowth. Horace Porter, who was on Grant's staff, saw it a year later, and he said it was a wilderness in the most forbidding sense of the word. So that's the area that you're now living in, but again, it's grown up now, so it doesn't seem, I hope at least, not quite so forbidding as it did then. Joe Hooker formed his troops in kind of an L-shaped line, with part of the line running from Chancellorsville up to the Rappahannock River to the north, and the rest of it running along what's today Route 3 all the way out to where that sign is today, where it says, I think it says Jackson Flank Attack. That's basically this, so if you picture a capital L kind of turned over on its side, the short end going north and long end going east to west, that's where Joe Hooker took up his stand. The 2nd and 5th Corps held the lower leg of the L, up closer to the river, whereas the 3rd and 12th Corps held the center of the line near Chancellorsville. The 11th Corps was way over on the right of this 6-mile long line. It had the responsibility of, again, holding the right for, oops, I'm going the wrong way, holding the right for the Army. The man who was on the far right was General Charles Devens. Oops, there's the flank movement you can see. And there's a good example of what the wilderness looked like, and that's, as you can tell, is during the winter months when they're wearing leaves on the trees. So try to imagine, again, all those thickets covered with leaves, and you get some ideas of these troops fighting. Try to imagine the command and control when a commander had to see what he was doing in order to maneuver his troops, and then try to imagine maneuvering in long lines of battle, shoulder to shoulder, 2 ranks deep, in thickets like that. Again, it was a very difficult place to fight a battle. But again, getting back to Charles Devens. Charles Devens was a Harvard law graduate. He was a prominent barrister and a state senator prior to the war. He had also been a brigadier general of state militia for 2 years prior to the war, so he did have some military experience. He had fought with the Union Army in the East prior to this, first in the 4th Corps and later in the 6th Corps. Like Howard, he was a New Englander and an abolitionist, and had been wounded on the peninsula, and had only recently joined the 11th Corps. And like Howard, his arrival was something of a source of discontent among his troops, again, because he was an outsider being brought in to command the 11th Corps instead of recruiting from within, you might say. Now he's going to have 2 brigades under him, Nathaniel McLean's Ohio Brigade and Leopold von Gils's brigade, which was made up of Pennsylvania and New York troops. Each of the divisions is going to have 2 brigades in it, so 3 divisions, 2 brigades each. The 2nd division is going to be led by Adolf von Steinberg. Doesn't he look like a German? I say that as somebody of German ancestry myself. He looks like my grandfather. Adolf von Steinberg was born into a German military family. He was educated at several military academies in Europe before immigrating to the United States. And like Devens, he had been a general in the state militia prior to the war. And again, he had 2 brigades which are going to be on the left end of General Howard's line. One is commanded by Francis Barlow, who, as you can tell from his name, is not a German. And the other is commanded by Adolphus Buschbeck, whose brigade was near Dallas Tavern, which is just a little bit to the east of where Wilderness Church is today. And the final division was commanded by Karl Schurz. He's perhaps the most interesting of Howard's division commanders. He was born in Prussia in 1829, had been a lieutenant among the revolutionaries during the 1848 revolution, and like the others, when the revolution failed, he fled to America to save his skin. And like Franz Siegel, he became a spokesman for the German-American community and also a leading abolitionist. And Siegel, he was rewarded for his loyalty to Abraham Lincoln by being, in his case, appointed to a diplomatic post abroad in 1861. But he got himself into a little trouble there. He kind of expressed his own views rather than the administration's views, and was quickly recalled. But in order to keep his support, he was, in Lincoln's inimitable fashion, appointed as a brigadier general in the Army instead. And by the time Chancellorsville comes around, he's going to be commanding a division in General Howard's 11th Corps. Schurz is going to be holding the center of the line between Steinwehr and General Devens. And he has under his command 2 distinctly long European names, Alexander Schimmelpfennig and Vladimir Krzyzanowski. I wouldn't want to have to write the orders for headquarters. Imagine way around out just writing down the names. Well, the 11th Corps position again was on the right. It was strung out for 1.5 miles along the Orange Turnpike, or what we would today call Route 3. Here you can see that's where the stoplight is, where Route 20 and Route 3 come together. That's in the 1800s, that's where the Plank Road, which ran this way, forked off from the older turnpike, which ran out to where we are today. So Wilderness Church is that it there? My eyes still aren't very good even with
Yes.
but there's Wilderness Church. And again, this is where the National Park Service has that sign out there today, and its tour stop on the right flank of the Corps. And then the rest of the Army stretched out farther to the left. So this is just the very right end of the line held by the 11th Corps. But that'll give you an idea of the ground which the 11th Corps held. The line, as you can, well, you can't really tell, but I'll take my word for it. The line basically faced to the south. It faced toward the Route 3. So it's on the north side of Route 3, but faced Route 3, because that's where the Confederates were. The Confederates at this point were actually nowhere near this area. They were way down on the other side of the Chancellor House site. So they're about 3 or 4 miles from the nearest Confederates when they first take up position here. One other thing to note about their position is that there is about a 4-mile gap between their right flank. Now this is, the entire line faces south except for 2 regiments which face off to the west, right here. The rest of the line faces to the south because that's where they thought the Confederates would come from. Over here to the right, there's 4 miles between the rightmost unit here and the river. 4 miles of territory that Stonewall Jackson would be able to exploit. More troops probably should have been placed there. Well, definitely more should have been placed there in retrospect to what happened, because it wasn't really a great defensive location. There isn't any ground up there that is really highly defensible. There's no mountains there like Cedar Mountain. There's no big rivers or creeks. The only things protecting them are these brambles and thickets, which General Howard would kind of look upon as a safety blanket. The long lines, as you can tell from the green, the lines actually, with the exception of the troops in the center, which are in this clearing near the Hawkins Farm and Wilderness Church, this part of the line is in these deep, dense thickets where you can't see from here to the end of the room. So again, this made not only maneuver difficult, but also it made surprise quite possible because the enemy could get quite close to you before you would even know that they were there. Jim Stewart, Lee's famous cavalryman, described the Union right flank, held by the 11th Corps, as being up in the air. In other words, it wasn't anchored on anything solid. They did try to compensate for that in some degree by digging some earthworks across their front, but these consisted mostly of shallow rifle pits, supplemented by what they called slashing, cut down brush just to kind of make it a little more difficult to get at them. Like the men who dug the works faced to the south, because that's again where they thought the Confederates would come from, if they came at all. Again, the only line facing west were these 2 regiments, which again faced out to the west. There was a second line of works also that faced to the west. This was commanded by Francis Barlow, and I don't think they show up on this map, but right in this area, they did, Barlow's brigade, which was in reserve, they were kind of the Corps Reserve, constructed a line of earthworks kind of running in this direction that faced off to the west. But again, these were only about knee-high or so when the attacks took place and would not prove much value to the Union Army. These works were started on May 1st, so by the time Stonewall Jackson attacked, the works were far from complete. Some people claim the works were strong, but others, again, disagreed with that. But it didn't really seem to matter on the morning of May 2nd, because the Confederate troops at that point were still miles away, threatening not the Union right flank, but instead the Union left flank and center. That changed at 9 o'clock in the morning when 3rd Corps scouts at Hazel Grove, which again, if you visit the battlefield, you know that Hazel Grove is kind of in this area. There it is, right in that area, kind of to the south. So the Union line runs like this. Hazel Grove's kind of near the center, Chancellorsville being right there. But 3rd Corps scouts on the morning of May the 2nd reported an ominous development, and that is they saw Confederate troops moving left to right across their front through this area here along what we today call the Furnace Road. Again, it's one of the park tour roads today. So this was passed up the line to Joe Hooker, who went out and took a look at it himself. And the movement, frankly, baffled him. He supposedly spread a map out on his bed, looked down at it, and talking to himself more than anyone else, he said, "It can't be retreat. Retreat without a fight, that is not Lee. If not retreat, what is it?" And then the answer seemed to come to him. He said, "Lee is trying to flank me." This should have been an obvious conclusion for Hooker, since Lee had done this over and over to the Army many times before in conjunction with Stonewall Jackson. But at this point, it looks like Joe Hooker, the light bulb's now come on, and now he's seen what Lee is up to. So at this point, at 9:30 in the morning, he's going to send a dispatch out to General Howard on the right flank, over here, telling him the Confederate troops have been seen moving from left to right across the Union front, in this direction, and heading in his direction. And he ordered Howard to take measures to meet an attack either from the front or on his right flank, that big gaping gap on his right. He urges the generals to improve their work, strengthen the right end of the line, keep heavy reserves in hand, and advance pickets for observation, which is a lot to ask, I think, from a corps that only had 12,000 men in it. One thing he did not do is to send any reinforcements over to General Howard. As it turns out, Hooker's warning was really unnecessary, because Howard himself had spotted the 11th Corps column about the same time as Hooker had, and he wrote to Hooker at 10:50 in the morning saying that a Confederate column was seen 1 to 2 miles south of his position, and saying, "I am taking measures to resist an attack from the west." So he sees the Confederates somewhere in this area, and now says that he is going to take measures to resist the flank attack, the same attack which actually did happen just a few hours later. However, the preparations that General Howard took were very minor ones. He placed his reserve artillery, which is 12 cannons, behind General Barlow's rifle pits, those ones that kind of went north from the road. He's going to put those guns there. I think you can kind of see that right there. He's also going to post a signal station beyond the Corps' right flank, so somewhere up in this area he's going to put a signalman. But beyond that, really, he did almost nothing, which is pretty extraordinary considering he's been told to expect an attack from that direction. He didn't change the position of hardly any of his infantry units. Beyond those two things, he did virtually nothing. Carl Schurz urged General Howard to align part of his own division to face the west, but General Howard refused. General Hooker, at that point, after issuing these orders, he kind of lost interest in what was going on over there, because by noon, he was convinced that the Confederates were not, in fact, going to attack him, but instead were in retreat. General Lee, again, was outnumbered 2-1. General Stone, by now, was working his way between Lee and Richmond, cutting his lines of communication. Hooker had a good defensive position there. It only made sense, under all those circumstances, that Lee did the sensible thing, retreat. And that's what Joe Hooker did. That's what 99 out of 100 generals would have done. But Robert E. Lee, of course, did not always follow convention. Anyhow, Joe Hooker thought about it and concluded that this movement did not portend, This movement did not portend a flank attack in this direction, but instead was a retreat by the Confederate Army toward Gordonsville, off in this direction, because Gordonsville was on the railroad, and if Lee was going to retreat toward Richmond, that'd be one of two directions he might possibly go to do that. So all of this started to fit together in Joe Hooker's mind, and speaking as an amateur psychologist with no training whatsoever, this is, I think, what Joe Hooker wanted to believe. All of his actions up to this point in the battle seemed to indicate that Joe Hooker was very happy to win a bloodless first victory over Lee. He wanted for Lee to retreat without a fight instead of crushing him while he had him in his grasp. And again, so I think Hooker very gladly seized upon this idea that this is a retreat. In any case, he does not take any measures. He does not ride out to see what's going on in Howard's flank, does not communicate with Howard much for the rest of the day, because now his eyes are focused on Lee retreating. As the afternoon progresses, Hooker decides that he should pursue the Confederates. He's very happy for a couple hours just to let them go, but then Dan Sickles, one of his more combative generals, came up to him and said, "Hey, if they're retreating, shouldn't we go and attack them? Because after all, if you let them get away, they'll just dig in at the next river, and then you have to attack in a trench position. If you can get them while they're marching, they don't have any of those works to fight behind." So Joe Hooker, who knew his military strategy well enough, and he said, "Well, I think you're right." So he's going to send the 12th Corps and part of the 3rd Corps south to harass the Confederates and hurry them along a little bit, or to capture some wagons, as one of his generals put it. So, I don't know if we have that here. No, we don't have that. So anyhow, if you can picture Hooker's line, again in this inverted L, picture the center of the line suddenly dropping to the south and disconnecting with the troops on its left and on its right. And who are the troops on its right? General Howard's 11th Corps. So instead of being part of a continuous line as it had been at the beginning of the day, now as these troops move south toward the Catherine Furnace, all of a sudden General Howard finds himself 1.5 miles away from his nearest supports. So when Stonewall Jackson finally strikes, he's not only going to outnumber General Howard, he's not only going to hit him on the flank, he's not only going to surprise him, but General Howard is going to have nobody to fall back on for help. So this helps to explain why Jackson's attack was so successful. There was a great deal of evidence coming in from the right flank that something was going on out there in the woods. The Federals had some skirmishers out there ahead of them, and some of these men sent back word to their commanders that there's something strange going on in those woods out there. The signalman who had established his station beyond the Union right flank, he reported seeing Confederates moving over around the right flank of the Union Army. That was in the morning of the 2nd. And he said it was infantry, artillery, and cavalry. But again, this was later interpreted as a retreat rather than an attack. In fact, he wrote that the enemy was moving to the west, quote, with the evident intention of either passing around our right or of retreating. General Devens, who was commanding on the right, he apprised General Howard, his superior, of this, but no one seems to have taken the trouble to investigate it. About noon, skirmishing starts to take place along the right end of the Union line. At this point, Colonel Charles Friend, who was one of the officers of the day in the Corps, reported Confederates moving around the right flank, but nobody did anything about it. Colonel John Lee of 55th Ohio, who was also in the 11th Corps, also reported to his superiors that troops were massing on the right flank. And he was told that that couldn't be the case, because if it was, General Hooker would have notified the 11th Corps High Command of this, which again is kind of twisting things around. The 11th Corps should be notifying Hooker of what's going on their front, not the other way around. But that's not the way it worked on this day. Twice during the day, Colonel Lee returned to headquarters and begged his commander to do something, reposition your troops to meet what he saw was going to be an imminent attack. But he was instead sent away from headquarters, being accused of being frightened, and his commander said it was not worthwhile to be scared before we were hurt. So again, you can see there's a kind of a faulty attitude in the Union High Command that day. Again, and that's just a couple of reports. Many others came in. Pickett's brought in 2 men who had seen Confederates moving around the right flank. Colonel William Noble of the 17th Connecticut warned of a Confederate buildup on the right flank of the Army. But again, this made no difference. The commanders on that wing did not take the trouble to investigate these things. Instead, they insisted that the Confederates were in retreat. And why did they think that? Because that's the word that was coming out of headquarters. So nothing really is done during the hours leading up to Stonewall Jackson's attack. General Howard has to be blamed as much as anybody for this. Howard, from the very beginning, thought it unlikely that Robert E. Lee would divide his army in the face of a superior force and make an attack through these woods, which again, he kind of viewed as a safety blanket. He didn't think anybody could attack through these dense thickets. So Howard, I don't think, ever really took the threat of an attack on his right flank very seriously. And then as the day progresses, as the afternoon progresses, Howard can hear from his position up there on Route 3, he can hear the sound of cannons off to the southeast of him, down near Catherine Furnace. You all know what Catherine Furnace is, right? That chimney stack that's down there along the Park Tour Road just to the south. We can hear the shelling between the end of Stonewall Jackson's column and the troops of the 3rd Corps fighting down there. And this seems to confirm what headquarters is reporting. That is, that the Confederates are retreating, and now the Federals are after them and attacking the rear of their column down near Catherine Furnace. It all seems to make a great deal of sense. And as a result of that, Howard rejected almost all reports of the Confederate buildup on his right flank. He dismissed these reports as the product of inexperienced pickets, keeping in mind again that almost half the 11th Corps had never before seen a Confederate. So in Howard's mind, he's probably thinking, okay, we probably saw a few dismounted Confederate cavalry out there and are now exaggerating this because, again, these guys have never seen a Confederate before in their life and they don't know a corps from a company. So anyhow, he doesn't pay much experience, doesn't give the pickets credibility for what they're reporting. In fact, he treated them very harshly when some of his officers brought in these reports. Colonel Friend, who we met earlier, was the first to suffer his wrath. He was upbraided for trying to get up a scare by General Howard. When Friend returned an hour later to again say, there's something going on out there, Howard told him the Confederates were in full retreat and again accused him of being a coward. Again, it doesn't make you want to report your findings after that, does it? Lieutenant Alvy Searles received the same response. Searles was on the picket line out there beyond the Union Corps right flank, and he could actually hear the Confederates massing for an attack. It's kind of hard to hide 30,000 men moving around in the woods, and Searles could hear all this. And so he sent orders back through his officers with warnings, but he said they all came back without anything being done. The last one reported back to me that General Howard said that Lieutenant Searles must not be scared of a few bushwhackers. So again, the reports are coming in, they're just being entirely ignored. Major Owen Rice also discovered the enemy's presence. At 2:45 in the afternoon, he's going to send a message to General von Gilsa, General von Gilsa, who's on the far right. He's the farthest right of anybody in the 11th Corps. He sends a message to von Gilsa saying, "A large body of the enemy is massing in my front. For God's sake, make dispositions to receive him." Von Gilsa hand-carried this dispatch to his superior and then to General Howard, but in each case was rebuked. So again, reports are coming in, nothing's being done. Gilsa might have been better received had he come about 1 hour earlier to General Howard's headquarters, because shortly before he arrived, Howard got a visit from Captain Alexander Moore of General Hooker's staff. He reported that David Birney, who commanded the troops immediately on Howard's left, had now been taken out of line and moved to the south toward the Catherine Furnace to harass the Confederate retreat. And now Hooker was asking if General Howard would send an extra brigade from his own corps down to support that movement. Well, if you're General Howard, you're thinking to yourself, would Hooker not only take away the troops immediately to my left, but also my own inner corps reserve if he thought there was any chance that I'm going to be attacked, like he told me earlier in the day. And so Howard not only acquiesced in that, but ultimately he decided to accompany that brigade, which was Francis Barlow's brigade, by the way, down to the furnace. So for the last couple of hours before Jackson makes his attack, the 11th Corps is without its leader. His leader is 2 or 3 miles away where the action is, instead of being back at 11th Corps headquarters. One man who was worried by all this was Carl Schurz. He too had gotten reports of this supposed buildup of Confederates on their right flank, but unlike many of the other top officers, he actually believed it, maybe because he was a German and had more faith in his German troops. He urged General Howard to take General Devon's division, which was on the right, and wheel it around to face the west, to cover part of that huge gaping hole on his right flank. But General Howard refused to do so. Schurz, on his own hook, decided to take 2 of his regiments, which again are fairly small units compared to a corps, but he's going to take 2 of those regiments and it's going to turn them to face the west. But other than that, that's about the only thing that was done that afternoon, because he was told not to change his positions. He shared his fears with Captain Hubert Dilger. Dilger commanded an artillery battery in the Corps and was down near Schurz's headquarters. He heard what was going on, and Schurz is going to tell Dilger, he's going to say, look, we have orders, we can't change the position of our troops, but there's reports of something going on out there, so I want you to know that if an attack comes from the right, I want you to have in mind beforehand what you're going to do, how you're going to turn your guns around so you're not entirely surprised. So Dilger did that, but then Dilger took an extra step, which some of his superiors might have well done, and that is he decided to ride out and see if these reports were true. And so he goes riding out on one of these artillery horses, makes his way down a path through the woods, and suddenly stumbles upon a small clearing where he sees thousands of Confederates lined up, waiting to go into battle. No sooner does he see this, however, than the Confederates see him, and all of a sudden there is a chase as some cavalrymen pursue Dilger through the woods. You can imagine the branches slapping him in the face. He goes galloping to the rear to escape. He does escape, but he also finds himself far away from the 11th Corps by the time he finally finds his way out of these woods and into the clearing. So since he's already closer to Chancellorsville than he is to his own corps, he decides, well, I'll go tell General Hooker about what I've seen. Goes to General Hooker's headquarters. He's not allowed to see the general, but his Hooker staff listens to his story and says, don't you know what's going on? Haven't you heard that the Confederates are retreating? You can hear this fighting going on down there. Go back to your corps and tell your yarn to General Howard. So General Dilger gets on his horse, rides back to General Howard's headquarters, which is at Dowdall's Tavern, which is no longer there today, but it's where he's got a little monument on the right side of the road as you're driving toward Chancellorsville. But he goes back there, but it's now late in the afternoon. Where's General Howard? He's down at Catherine Furnace. He's not there. So at this point, he talks to General Howard's staff. They basically say, you think you know more than the generals do? Everybody knows that the Confederates are retreating. Who are you, a captain, to tell us otherwise? So they told him, they said, go back to your battery and leave us alone. So Dilger goes back to his battery, reports to Short. Short says, okay, nothing we can do about it. But again, get ready, because an attack might come before dark. Well, the attack did come before dark. It commenced sometime after 5 o'clock, depending on whose watch you want to believe. The 11th Corps camp at that point was relatively quiet. There was some rumors going around that the Confederates were out there, but nobody really knew what to believe if you were a soldier in the ranks. Besides, it was dinner time, and the men were busy slaughtering cattle and making fires and getting ready for the evening meal. And also, it was getting pretty late. It was kind of late for an attack to start taking place. Usually attacks took place in the morning, so you had the whole day to develop them. The sun was already very low in the sky. So everybody was thinking, well, this is just another army rumor. So they're making their camps, making their dinner. A couple of bands are playing. It looked like the day was going to end very quietly. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, from these dense thickets, suddenly 1 deer, 2 deer, 3 deer, squirrels. One person becomes a bear, came out of the woods into the clearing there around Wilderness Church. The soldiers didn't know what to make of this. All they knew that it was dinner time, and all of a sudden there were deer that they could slaughter and add to the stew. So actually some of them started cheering. But the cheering didn't last long, because just a moment or two later came this ominous sound. Boom! Boom! 2 artillery pieces firing immediately on the right flank, straight down what's today Route 3. Stonewall Jackson's attack had begun. And that sound was followed by the worst of all possible sounds. If you were a Union soldier, you know what that was? The rebel yell. Not only the rebel yell, but the rebel yell cheered by 30,000 Confederates on your flank, bearing down on you, all of whom had one purpose in mind, that is to kill you. So again, keep in mind, 40% of the men in the Corps haven't ever seen a Confederate before, and the other ones have only been defeated by them. What's going to happen when suddenly Stonewall Jackson comes crashing in on their flank? There's not going to be a whole lot of resistance. Von Gilsa, again, is the first victim. He had 5 regiments, but only 2 of them faced to the west. So he's covering maybe a couple hundred yards of ground. Stonewall Jackson's line stretches out for more than 1.5 miles. So, needless to say, his flanks are going to be turned immediately. Von Gilsa reported, probably very optimistically, that his troops fired 3 rounds and then fled. I suspect they fired no rounds and then fled, but he put 3 rounds in his report. His regiments facing to the south couldn't even do that, because keep in mind, in those days they fought in long lines of battle. If the enemy attacked you from the right and you as an individual turned to shoot at them, who are you going to hit? The guys to your right. So what you have to do is you have to take your whole line out and wheel the whole line around and then fire at once. That's difficult to do under stress at any time, but it's particularly difficult, again, when you're surprised and when you're in these dense thickets where it's hard to maneuver for a single individual, much less a whole line of men. So as a result, Gilsa's men pretty much couldn't do much of anything before Jackson's men hit them and drove them from the field. Most of them threw down their rifles without firing a shot. They then came in and were hit by Nathaniel McLean's brigade, called the Ohio Brigade because most of its units were from that state. McLean had 5 regiments, 3 in the front line, 2 in reserve. When Jackson attacks, Devens ordered the 2 reserve units to wheel to the right and basically attack whatever was in the woods coming at them. They're going to attack them. They had time to do it because Jackson had farther to go to get to them. Colonel Robert Riley led the 75th Ohio in the attack, but Jackson's line fell on him like an avalanche. His regiment was routed and Riley was left dying on the field. Colonel William Richardson also led his 25th Ohio into the attack. He too was quickly overwhelmed and driven from the field. Richardson was one of those officers who was accused by his superiors of cowardice earlier in the day for bringing reports of Confederate buildup. He fell with a dangerous but not mortal wound. The rest of McLean's regiments, just like the rest of Dills's, couldn't fire because they're facing the wrong direction. John C. Lee, who we met earlier, he's going to ride back to headquarters and urge his commander to face the troops to the west, and was told not yet. He returned, saw the right flank giving way, rode back to headquarters, again urged him to turn the flank to the right. But by that time, it was just too late to do it, and McLean's brigade was entirely wiped out as well. So the entire right division under Charles Devens is demolished within 20 minutes, and Jackson moves forward to seize what's called the Tally House Plateau, which is at the right, kind of where the plank road meets the Route 3 today. General Howard just so happened to be returning about this time from his jaunt down to the Catherine Furnace. He rode up to the Wilderness Church where he sees a sight which must have just dismayed him, the sight of his entire right flank just giving way in utter panic. He would later describe this. He said, "I could see numbers of our men, not the few stragglers that always fly like chaff at the first breeze, but scores of them, rushing into the opening, some with arms, some without, running or falling before they got behind the cover of General Devens' reserves, and before General Shorts' waiting masses could deploy or charge. The noise and smoke filled the air with excitement, and to add to it, guns and caissons with batterymen scattered, rolled and tumbled like runaway carts in a thronged city. The guns and masses on the right brigade struck the second of the line of Devens before McLean's front had given way, and more quickly than it could be told, with all the fury of the wildest hailstorm. Everything, every sort of organization that lay in the path of the mad current of panic-stricken men had to give way and be broken into fragments." Try to imagine if you were in a crowd of people and all of a sudden somebody started firing shots and everybody started running towards you. Try to imagine forming a line of battle while hundreds of thousands of people are racing through you in utter panic. That's what General Howard was now, and General Shorts were now faced with. General Howard, there's the flank attack. You can see how Jackson's line overlaps the Union right by quite a considerable distance, allowing Jackson's men to fire down the flank of the Union line. But as Howard's right is giving way, Howard is now going to try to make up for his earlier negligence with a show of courage. He's going to take a regimental flag from one of his fleeing regiments, place it under the stump of his amputated arm, and attempt to rally Devens' men near the intersection where Route 20 and Route 3 is today. His horse was shot out from under him, but he still continued to try to rally his men. Some of them heeded his cry and joined Carl Schwartz's division there near the church. Others simply cried, "We've done all we can," and continued running down the road. Howard dashed to the east of the clearing to get his reserve artillery in position to fire at the Confederates. He later wrote, he said, "I felt that I wanted to die. It was the only time I ever weakened that way in my life, before or since, but that night I did all in my power to remedy the mistake, and I sought death everywhere I could find an excuse to go on the field." At this point, the fighting is going to shift from the heavy woods over on the 11th Corps right flank into the clearing where Carl Schwartz's division is, around the church and the Tally House. You can see again the clearing there is where the white is, and again the church, I think, is roughly here. So now the French are moving out of these dense thickets into the open clearing. Carl Schwartz, as you remember, had actually had believed the reports that were coming into his division that day, and he had taken it on his own responsibility to face 2 of his regiments to face toward the flank. But now that the attack had started, he's going to do more than that. He's going to take his entire line, which had faced south, and now is going to wheel it around, almost like a top, one man said, and face it in the direction from where the Confederates are coming. A Union picket said, "I remember as we came out through that valley, we saw the Hawkins house, which is just north of the church, and still there today, or at least on the same site, and saw Schurtz's line of battle with his flags waving right toward us. Devens' division had melted away and was screaming back upon him. Round came Schurtz's line like a top, swinging sharply as though upon a pivot. I never saw anything done so quick. Not more than 2 minutes before Schurtz's men were facing south. Now their front was to the west, in unbroken line, shoulder to shoulder, to stem the torrent of men." Why is Schurz able to get his men wheeled around, and whereas Devens was not? Because he had a clearing. He didn't have to fight those woods. He had open fields to work with. However, Schurz only has 5,000 men, and he's facing roughly 18,000 Confederates at this point, what the women's called a perfectly solid mass of men. As the Confederates moved from the woods into the clearing, they continued to press on. They were now in a great deal of disorder, but they were so enthusiastic that it didn't really matter. They just kept pressing straight ahead. Howard wrote that they came in such multitudes that our men went down before them like trees in a hurricane. Hubert Dilger, the artilleryman, he anchored General Schurtz's line on the left near the Orange Turnpike, and as Confederates emerged from the woods, he and the guns of the reserve artillery are going to fire. There's the Wilderness Church and the Hawkins farm over there to the right of it. So General Schurtz's line was just on the other side of the church, just on the western side of the church, as you're looking at it in this picture. Again, the Hawkins house is up there on the right. But the reserve artillery is farther back on the back side of the clearing. It's in the clearing, but it's on the far side from where the Confederates are coming. So the reserve artillery is now 12 guns are going to be opening up on the Confederates as they come out of those woods. But they're only going to have a very minimal impact because the artillery has its back to the wilderness, to these trees, and General Howard, fearing that he's going to lose these 12 guns because they can't get away, the Confederates keep coming, orders them off the field very quickly so he doesn't lose his guns as well as lose his infantry troops. But while they're there, they're going to help Carl Schurz resist the Confederate advance. The Confederates are going to, however, overlap both Schurtz's left flank and his right flank. Again, Schurz has a line a few hundred yards long, but the Confederate line is much longer, so they're just going to wrap themselves around the flanks and fire down the line. The Confederates are going to turn their flanks. They're going to charge Dilger's gun, capture one of them, and force Dilger to fall back along the road, firing as he goes with that one cannon along the narrow road. Schurtz's line is going to stand for maybe 20 minutes. Time's hard to judge in these things because everybody remembered differently, but maybe as much as 20 minutes Schurtz's line is going to make a stand. Confederates now pushing through the clearing where the Federals have been making their dinners just a short time earlier. They've been marching all day. They haven't had anything since breakfast. And so now they're passing steaming kettles of coffee and food that's been laid out for them. It would take a pretty stalwart Confederate to not give in to such temptations. And the Confederates didn't have many people that were that stalwart when it came to taking food. And an officer gets noted that the Confederates swept forward like a cyclone. Obstacles that harassed our advance and hampered our retreat yielded to the fierce momentum of an army in threefold volume of masses, all saturated with the spirit of their almost superhuman leader. The confident enthusiasm and resolute ardor of that massive attack, clad in ashen gray and simple trappings, has never been surpassed. The wrath of God pervaded it. Well, Schurz is driven off the field, Devens is driven off the field. That leaves
Barlow.
Yeah, that. Excuse me?
Barlow.
No, not. You're close. It left. Now I'm forgetting it. General von. He's got some.
Your grandfather.
Otto von Steinwehr. Otto von Steinwehr. Excuse me, I was thinking von. Otto von Steinwehr. But remember, each of these divisions has how many brigades in it? Two. Barlow and Adolphus Buschbeck were the two in Steinwehr's division. What had happened to Barlow? He'd been sent down to the Catherine Furnace earlier. That's the unit that Howard had accompanied down to the furnace. So Barlow's not there. So now, out of the entire 11th Corps, you have one brigade left that hasn't been routed to face Stonewall Jackson's oncoming masses. And that's, again, Adolphus Buschbeck. By now, the battle's about an hour old. The Confederates, of course, are tired, but they're, again, bumped up by adrenaline with their victory. And now they're standing in their way. It's only one other unit, Bushbeck's brigade, roughly maybe 2,000 strong at this point in time. They're posted again near Dallas Tavern. Again, if you see driving along the road toward the Chancellorsville Visitor Center, on the right side of the road, you'll see that little monument on the right, kind of the half-moon shape. That marks the spot where the Bushbeck line, as it's called, the entrenchments basically dug by Bushbeck's men. They stood just about where that monument is today, on the south side of the road. So they're there, 2,000 strong, but with reinforcements from some of the other units that have fled the field, maybe they had as many as 4,000 men. What they didn't have is artillery support. Now that they're hemmed in between their works and the trees, Howard decides he better call them off. Bushbeck's men fought stubbornly while they were there. They might have held out until dark if they had only to contend with frontal assaults, but keep in mind Jackson's lines extended around their flanks, and very soon they found fire coming down their lines. No troops are going to stand when they can't defend themselves. So if you're facing this way and the enemy's firing down this way, you're going to throw down your rifle and run pretty quick. And that's pretty much what Bushbeck's men did. So by this point, by the time the sun is now setting, the entire 11th Corps, 12,000 men minus casualties, is fleeing in utter panic through the woods and down the road from that 11th Corps position toward the Chancellor House site. John Collins, who was in a different unit, he described the scene near Chancellorsville. He said, the plank roads and the woods that bordered it presented a scene of terror and confusion, such as I had never seen before. Men and animals were dashing against one another in wild dismay before the line of fire that came crackling and crashing after them. The constantly approaching rattle of musketry, the crash of the shells through the trees, seemed to come from three sides upon the broken fragments of the 11th Corps that crowded each other on the road. More than half the runaways had thrown their arms away, and all of them were talking a language that I did not understand, of course German, but by their tones evidently blaming someone for the disgrace and disaster that had befallen their corps. Even before Bushbeck's line gave way, fugitives from General Devon's division, General Short's division, were already making their way past the Chancellor House site 1.5 miles away. These guys could run if they had to, and many of them did. In fact, one of Hooker's men was sitting on the porch, and for some reason they couldn't really hear, because of some strange acoustics, they couldn't really hear very well the sound of the attack that was taking place just a couple miles away. So they're sitting on the porch, and all of a sudden one of the staff officers looked down and sees this torrent of men racing in utter panic down the road, like a stream of men in their direction. And he suddenly turned and said, "Here they come!" At which point Hooker got on his horse, rode out, and realized that his day had taken a turn for the worse. So as these men arrived at Chancellorsville, they didn't receive a whole lot of sympathy from the men in the other corps. William Osborne, who was a 3rd Corps artillery chief, he noted that Howard's men, quote, had been routed and were fleeing the river like scared sheep. The men and artillery filled the road, sides, and skirts of the field, and it appeared that no two of one company could be found together. Aghast and terror-stricken, their heads bare and panting for breath, they pleaded like infants at the mother's breast that we should let them pass to the rear unhindered. Many of them, when they got back to the Chancellor House, had one thought in mind, that is, save their skin by getting across the river. The river was the safety. So when they got there, they couldn't remember which road it was, so they started asking to people, "Varsh die pontoons? Varsh die pontoons? There was too many men for us." "I is going to my company," some of them protested, which of course wasn't true. One man had the misfortune of asking that question to General Winfield Scott Hancock, who, if you're familiar with General Hancock, he was one of the most tough officers in the Army and was known for not only being a hard-bitten soldier, but being a very loquacious man when it came to profanity. And Hancock, the man who wrote about this episode, said he didn't wish to put Hancock's response into cold and unsympathetic type. Some of these 11th Corps soldiers were so panicked by Jackson's attack that they literally ran past the Chancellor House, down the road for another mile, passing through the back of the other line. Keep in mind the Union line kind of went like this, so they ran through, down past their own line, through the line on the other side, and were captured by Confederates on the other side of the Army. That's how panic-stricken they were. There were efforts to rally the 11th Corps. General Howard led the effort. He was mounted in the road, again with that flag under his stump. He entreated the men to stop and to face the enemy, ordered his officers to cover the road and let nobody pass. But again, it was like holding back Johnstown flood. It just couldn't be done. One soldier wrote, he says that the number constantly increased, the pressure became greater and greater upon the line that blocked the way. At last, the seething, surging sea of humanity broke over the feeble barrier, and General Howard and his officers were carried away by main force with the tide. Well, Howard continued his efforts, and by 9 o'clock, he was successful in rallying about half of the Corps. The Corps was placed into a hasty line just west of Chancellorsville between the house site and the visitor center on the north side of the road, where it remained for the rest of the night until it was relieved by other troops. By then, Stonewall Jackson had been wounded by the mistaken fire of his own troops, and unknown to the Federals, the Confederate line would lurch to, the kind of advance would lurch to a halt with Jackson's wounded. That night, the 11th Corps was again relieved of its position, sent back to the house site, the Chancellor House site, where it reformed, and later, the next morning, was placed on the other side of the Army, as far away from the Confederates as they could put them, over near Mineral Springs on the Rappahannock River, excuse me. The battle was still 3 days, had still 3 days to go, but for the 11th Corps, the battle was over. It had suffered 2,400 casualties in the course of its short but fierce battle, more than 25% of those engaged. Losses, by the way, today, if a unit suffers 10% casualties, the unit's considered basically to be too damaged to continue in action. They lost 25%. The losses were particularly high among the officers. Of the 23 regimental commanders in the battle, more than half of them were casualties. So it wasn't from any cowardice that the 11th Corps was driven from the field. Nevertheless, they were blamed for defeat, not only by Hooker, but by the rest of the Army. Of course, the Army hadn't known the circumstances leading up to the 11th Corps' rout. All they knew is that, the only thing they knew is that they saw the 11th Corps running without arms like a scared flock of sheep through their own lines, but they had no idea why they were running. If they had, perhaps they would have been a little bit more charitable. But the 11th Corps, in my view, had performed just about as well as any troops could have performed that day under the circumstances. They had discovered and reported Jackson's flanking movement earlier in the day, and reported the threat repeatedly to its various commanders. Oops. That's, again, some bones in the wilderness, as is seen next year because they weren't burying. When struck in the flank and the rear by Jackson's force, which was more than twice their strength, the Corps fought very stubbornly, inflicted, we think, about 1,000 casualties on Jackson's men, and delayed the Confederate attack for about an hour and a half, giving Hooker time during the night to shuffle his army around to meet the threat the next day. Despite all this, the Army denounced the Corps as the Flying Dutchman. The image was reinforced, unfortunately, 2 months later at Gettysburg, when the Corps was again struck by the Confederates, again on the flank, and again gave way. Hooker and others, very eager to deflect blame from the cells, blamed the 11th Corps in their reports and also in front of congressional investigative committees. Among those critical of the Corps' conduct was General Howard himself, who ascribed the debacle not only to his own negligence, but to a want of resistance by his troops, which is utterly unfair. The 11th Corps, needless to say, was incensed when they heard this criticism. Carl Schurz asked that his official report, which is very lengthy, be made public because it gave the circumstances of the defeat. The War Department, however, refused to do so until Hooker issued his report. You know when Hooker issued his report? He didn't. Hooker, tellingly, never wrote a report of the battle. General Schurz, at that point, requested a court of inquiry into the attack, and that was also denied. So the War Department was complicit in covering up the reasons for the defeat that day. To this day, the image of the Flying Dutchman still remains firmly impressed upon the minds of those who study the battle. Fortunately, interpretation's changing a little bit on that, but even now, it's kind of hard to shake people's die-hard belief that the 11th Corps was simply fought badly and were surprised because of their own fault. That the 11th Corps did fly, there isn't any doubt of that, and in fact, nobody ever tried to deny it. But while it's true that the Corps fled, it's also true that no force of comparable size, particularly one comprised of that larger percentage of new troops, could have withstood an attack by Jackson's hardened veterans under such conditions. That the men of the 11th Corps stood at all, even for a little while, it, in my mind, makes them worthy of our praise rather than of our scorn. So, that's it. I'll be happy to make questions. questions?
So, did Hooker have no intelligence leading to General Lee's progress? I mean, he had no spies, no internal intelligence as to what Lee was intending?
No. Apparently Hooker, except for what could be seen by his pickets, Hooker had, again, spies wouldn't do any good because, again, spies couldn't move between the opposing lines.
Yeah.
They were very good use to him before the battle. There were two spies, a fellow named Silver, who lived down in the Chancellorsville area, who sent back a very detailed reports, not only as to how many Confederates were in Lee's army, which was accurate within 2,000 men, but exactly where they were all positioned. But that was before the battle. Once the battle took place, spies couldn't move freely across the countryside. And of course, what the other major ways of gathering information were by balloon, but Hooker didn't take the balloons with him out to Chancellorsville. He left them back at Fredericksburg because the heavy woods he thought wouldn't be conducive to balloon observation. And also the cavalry. Where was the cavalry? This was George Stoneman making its way around the rear. So Hooker was kind of left blind in the wilderness once he set off his cavalry. So all he could see was what his skirmishers reported to him. And again, even as we saw, even the skirmishers' reports weren't taken seriously by Hooker or by the other members of the high command. Howard actually went on to greater glory, as it turns out. He he did reasonably well at the Battle of Gettysburg, except, well, I shouldn't say that. His troops were routed at the Battle of Gettysburg, but he did help rally them and stabilize them. But then he and his corps is going to be sent out to Tennessee, where they're going to take part in the Battle of Chattanooga, and are going to do reasonably well there. In fact, to such a degree that Howard's later going to be made an army commander out in Georgia under Sherman. Yeah, which rankled Hooker to no end, because Hooker is also going to be sent out there as well, and to see this guy who he's blamed for basically the ruining his reputation and career be promoted while Hooker's not really galled Hooker.
How did the cannons do with all the thicket?
They couldn't be used to any great extent. They can only be used in the clearings. And as you know, the clearings were kind of few and far between. Yeah. But where there were clearings, they masked them. Again, if you're driving from here toward Chancellor, just before you get to the Chancellor House, you look off of that field to the right, yeah. You'll see some cannons there. Go down there and walk out in the field there somewhere. You will see lined up in that field 34 U-shaped gun pits. Probably the greatest collection of gun pits on any battlefield that I can think of, field fortifications. 34 in a line facing to the west, in the direction Stonewall Jackson's attack was coming from. And they on May the 3rd, the day after all this took place, they are going to play a major role in stopping the Confederate attack and inflicting just tremendous casualties. We think that something like the neighborhood of 20,000 men were casualty. Let's see. I want to make sure I'm getting that right. I almost get twisted in my mind. Anyhow, roughly 20,000 casualties took place on that morning. In a course of about 4 hours' time in the woods between where the Chancellor House is now and the Chancellor House and the Chancellorsville Visitor Center. In that 1 mile, a mile north of the road, a mile south, and a mile this way, roughly 20,000 men fell in 6 hours' time, making possibly the third bloodiest day of the Civil War. Again, it's kind of hard to say that because again, they didn't group things by day; they grouped them by battle, the casualties. But that's what John Hennessy has concluded, and I think he's maybe very correct in that. So very, very bloody, and largely because of the artillery. Any other questions? In that case, I thank you very much, and we'll...
And remember, let's see. Oh, there are a few books left, so if you want to buy his books, and no extra charge for the signature, I think. But wait, Darcy, don't go. One last thing, celebrating her, I don't know which 16th birthday it is, but Darcy here, it's her birthday session.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Darcy. Happy birthday
this year's program schedule is full, and I've already started on next year, have January and February all set. As a matter of fact, I'm speaking in February, which scares the but anyway, have a good evening and a safe journey home.
Before you go, please remember to visit our website often, civilwarstudygroup.org. We make every attempt on a regular basis to provide informative content. Thank you for visiting, and God bless.